right. We're over in the book of 2 Corinthians. That's a mite loud, isn't it? Or is it? Maybe I'm just loud. Okay, everybody here fine? All right. We're in 2 Corinthians, chapter number 2. And when we finish tonight, I'm going to give you some questions again to think about between tonight and next week. And just imagine now, in a couple of more weeks, you won't get any more questions from me. Okay? So you won't have to look up anything between classes or consider anything, all right? But I will give you a couple tonight when we get ready to finish. And hopefully they will be something that as you study and think about them, we'll have some maybe a little more in-depth discussion after we have talked about them. But we mentioned in verse number 6 of 2 Corinthians chapter 2, where it says, "Sufficient unto the man is this punishment which was inflicted of many." And then we begin in verse 7 where it says, "So that contrariwise ye ought rather to forgive him and comfort him, lest perhaps such a one should be swallowed up with overmuch sorrow." And we noted, and we've talked about the first of these three words I said that were important in this and the next verse. We've talked about forgiveness. Now we want to talk about this idea of comfort. The definition of comfort is very simple. It is an encouragement with alleviation of grief. Does that sound like what happens when someone comforts you? Do they encourage you, and do they help to alleviate or do away with the grief that you're suffering for whatever reason that's bringing on the discomfort to you? So when we talk about comfort, we're trying to make this person, and Paul is writing to the church here on behalf, in this particular section of his book, he's writing this to ensure that those Christians in Corinth do what they can to make sure that this brother who had been withdrawn from comes back and becomes productive and a part of the congregation again. And he doesn't want this brother to suffer any more than he already has, having been withdrawn from. And so he tells them here to give comfort to this brother. So I want us to look at some passages, and we're going to stay in the book of Romans. And there's several passages, and most of them are out of chapter 8 of the book of Romans. Chapter 8's an interesting chapter. And there's unfortunately a lot of false doctrine that comes out of chapter 8 also. For example, Romans chapter 8 is a chapter that the NIV butchers. The New International Version butchers this chapter because through what the NIV says, it is taught and it is believed by many religious groups that you and I are born sinners. That we are born sinners, and of course if we are born sinners, if that were true, which it is not, but if it were true, that would justify what? If a child is born a sinner, what would it justify doing? Baptizing that infant. And do denominational bodies baptize infants? For that very reason, don't they? That they believe that that child, when it's born, that perfectly beautiful baby, when it comes forth from his mother's womb and comes into this world, is a sinner. And if they die in infancy, they're going to be cast off into a devil's hell forever. And yet that child has never done one thing, either good or bad. But certainly no wickedness has ever come forth from that child. But because of the use of certain terms here in Romans chapter 8, many religious people, following what's said in those passages, makes it so that we have a sinful nature about us. That is, we are sinful from the time we're conceived. And so infant baptism and later on what they call confirmation becomes necessary in order to see that that baby doesn't die from some illness or disease or whatever and wind up in a devil's hell.
And also, a flaw in their logic is that they can't reasonably accept Jesus as their Savior since they don't know anything about him.
Yeah, that's one of the first flaws in it. But it goes all the way down the line. Sin is what? 1 John 3 and verse 4. Sin is the transgression of God's law, John wrote. And sin is the transgression of God's law. They haven't transgressed God's law, and yet they are called or known as sinners because of the mere fact of Adam committing sin, right? What is called Adamic sin, or some people refer to it as original sin. And they believe that that sin that Adam and Eve committed in the garden has been passed down to every generation. Now, it is true that that sin introduced itself into the world through their actions, didn't it? Before they ate that forbidden fruit, there was no sin in the world. And so in that sense, sin came into the world as a result of what they did, but that sin didn't pass on me or you until we commit sin, till we become old enough to know right and wrong. And then when we know right and wrong and we do what is wrong, then sin becomes a part of us, and then we have to repent to get rid of that sin at some point in time. And so Romans chapter 8 is a marvelous chapter. It's got some very important verses in it. Unfortunately, sometimes it's misused to teach a false doctrine. So it just shows you that while there are many things in Romans chapter 8 that we need to consider, and we're going to look at several, at the same time, it also is being used by denominational doctrine teachers to try to substantiate a most wicked belief that an innocent baby is a sinner because of what Adam did 6,000 years ago. And it has no bearing on whether or not that child is a sinner or a righteous person. It's not based on that. It's based on what that child does when it grows up and knows right and wrong. We simply call it the age of accountability. And it varies, doesn't it? Some people are aware of right and wrong at 8, 9, 10 years old. Some don't really get a good feeling for right and wrong until they're 12, 14 years old, before they really understand that this is a sin if you do it. It's something that violates God's law. But we get a couple here that have to do with comfort. And I want us to take a look at these. Romans 8 and 28. I told you last week this is maybe one of my very most famous, favorite verses because of what it teaches. Not that it's any more important than any other verse. I don't mean that. But it says something. Listen to what it says in Romans 8:28. For we know that all things, how many things? All things. Now wait a minute now. You mean it's just not some things? We know that all things work together for good. Well, how about when something bad happens in my life? How about when tragedy comes? How about when disappointments and discouragements come? How about when things happen that I have a difficult time in dealing with? You mean to tell me that those things work together for good? And if so, how? How do they work for good? How can a child die in infancy and that be something that turns out to be good? Do you remember a man named King David? Do you remember something about David and a son that he had? Do you remember he had a son by a lady named what? Bathsheba. And you remember he committed a sin in the first place by taking a married woman and committing adultery with her. But what did David decide to do when he found out about the child that was going to be born, Bathsheba? When he found out he was going to bear that child, and that child got sick for 7 days and laid there hanging on to life, between life and death, and at the end of those 7 days, that child died. Did David get angry with God? He loved that child. He planned on that child being his successor to the throne of Israel. Did he get mad and throw his fist in the air? Did he blame God? Did he blaspheme God's name? When that child died and the servant came in to tell him, and he told him, he said, that son has died. And David had been there with sackcloth and ashes on to show his mourning. And when that servant told him that, what do you think went through that servant's mind? When you brought bad news to a king, what happened many times? Would he whack off your head? That was a common thing to bring bad news. The messenger would be killed for telling the king something he didn't want to hear. But what did David do? He made a famous statement. Do you remember that statement that David made?
The son can't come back to him, but he can go to the son.
That's it. I'm going to go where that son is one day. He can't come back to me. But you know what I can do? I can live my life in such a way that when I die, I'm going to go where he is. I'm going to see my son again. You see, David knew that that child, living 7 days, that child was innocent and pure in the eyes of God. And that child went to what we know as paradise. He went to that place that Christ went to from the cross. He went to paradise. And that child was there in paradise right that moment, awaiting the end of time. And David said, I can't bring him back. But I can do one thing. I can make sure I go where he is. Do you think David made it? You read the story of the rest of David's life. The friend of God, as he's referred to. Wouldn't you like to know that God considers you his friend? Because on Judgment Day, it's going to make all the difference, isn't it? If he's not your friend, what are you? What's the opposite of a friend? An enemy. And will the enemies be destroyed on that last day? Absolutely. So here he makes it plain that all things work together for good to them that love the Lord. Who does it work good for? Does it work good for all the people in the world? To them that love the Lord. And how do you know if you love the Lord? John 14 and verse 15. Jesus say on the night of his betrayal, the night before his crucifixion the next day, if you love me, keep my commandments. So how do you know that you love him? Because you keep his commandments. And so he said, to those who love him and are the called according to his purpose. Well, let me ask you here, how many of y'all have received your calling? How many of you have heard God call you? In the middle of the night, in the middle of a storm, in the middle of some great event. How many of you have heard God say, Joe, I want you to come and be mine? Anybody here ever heard that? So you ain't never been called, right? Now I'm playing the devil's advocate. He said called. Those who love him and are the called according to his purpose. So I guess it doesn't apply to you and me, does it? How are you and I called?
Called by the word.
By the word, the gospel. Isn't that what Paul told the Thessalonian church? He said, you're called by the gospel. So when I read this book, and I read what Christ has done, and I read what Christ wants me to do, he's giving me a calling right then to come and obey him. And so I can be the one who is called according to his purpose for what he wants me to be. And that is his child. That is his servant. So when you comfort somebody, isn't that one of the most marvelous things you can tell to somebody? Isn't it wonderful that you can tell them how much God loves them and how much God is going to see that no matter how bad your situation is, no matter what you've just gone through that seems so terrible to you, that God can make it turn out good. And in the end, through his providence, he can cause these events to occur in such a way that you wind up being blessed by even the most tragic thing that might happen to you and I. Is that comfort? Do you and I hold on to words like that? Do we see ourselves as wanting to have that confidence and comfort that God can give us? I hope we do. You know, as a Christian, sometimes we feel like, you know, when someone says, Luke, are you saved? And I've heard good, faithful children of God, Christian men and women who are striving every day to be the best person they can be. I've heard them say, well, I think so, or maybe, or I hope I am. Do we have, you know, we have a song, Blessed Assurance. Do you ever sing it? What do those words mean? Do you have a blessed assurance? Can you feel, I don't mean boastful, but can you be confident in your salvation? Can you feel like that, look, I'm doing each day the best I know how. Yes, I stumble. Yes, I fall. Yes, I sin. Yes, I do things I shouldn't. Yes, I fail to do other things that I should have done. But you know something? I keep asking God to forgive me every time I realize I've sinned. And I have an assurance if I do that, I don't have to walk around with no hope. I can walk around with the hope that I'm going to heaven, yes. Now again, I don't mean boastful. I don't mean bragging like, look at me, I'm perfect, I'm going to heaven. I don't mean that. I mean, I recognize my shortcomings, but at the same time, I recognize the power of God's blood and the promises he's made if I will do my best to follow him. And so, yes, we should have comfort in that. That should be one of those verses that we read and we think, I'm just so thankful. This gives me that feeling I know I can make it. Maybe I've wondered if I can. Now I know I can. So when we comfort somebody, is that a good thing to do? Look at verse 31. The last part of verse 31. For what shall we say to these things? If God be for us, who can be against us? Now, are we going to have enemies if we try to live the Christian life? Are there people going to try to pull us down? Are there people going to try to tempt and try us and to cause us to fall? And let's be honest, what's the biggest person we have to overcome? What's the biggest problem we have to overcome? Ourselves, don't we? Can you and I be the biggest detriment to our... Maybe we can deal with people in the world. Maybe we can even deal with people in the Lord's church who might cause us to question our faith or lose our faith. But the biggest problem we have to deal with is right here in you and I. And do we do that? Do we recognize if God's on my side, there is nobody or nothing that can keep me out of heaven? And we'll talk about that in just a moment. Because there is another passage we need to look at, don't we? Stay right here in Romans chapter 8, and let's look down at verse number 35. Look at verse 35 with me. What does he say here? Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation, shall distress, or persecution, or famine, or nakedness, or peril, or sword? Now, those are a lot of things that could cause us to lose our faith in God. Can any of these things separate us? As it is written, for thy sake we are killed all day long. We are accounted as sheep for the slaughter. Now listen at verse 37. Nay, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him that loved us. And I am persuaded, this is Brother Paul talking to Christians, for I am persuaded that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor powers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor height, nor depth, nor any creature shall be able to separate us from the love of God, which is in Christ Jesus our Lord. Now, he said none of those things can separate us from eternal blessings in heaven one day. So is it possible for a Christian to be lost? Is it possible for someone to be baptized and lose their hold on salvation? I think we've all seen people who have done that very thing in our lifetimes. So if none of these things can do it, how can they be lost? All right. You notice he didn't say yourself or your being. He said none of these outside sources can cause you to be lost. You can deal with any and every problem that the world can come up with. And there's only one thing that can separate you, as there was only one thing that could save you, and that was yourself. Can you save somebody else? You can't save somebody else, can you? You can pray and encourage and teach and do whatever you can to try to help that person find salvation, but you can't save somebody except yourself. And the only thing that can destroy you and overcome you is not these things in the world, but yourself. So while no other creature can cause me to be lost, I can cause me to be lost. So when I think about the power the devil has, and he is powerful, isn't he? And by the way, how many servants does the devil have? Anybody got a count? Anybody count them up? Well, I know how we can figure it, can't we? We can figure it very simply. Everybody who is not serving the Lord is serving who? Satan, the devil. What did Jesus say? You're either for me or against me. There's no such thing as being neutral, is there? Neutrality doesn't exist in the spiritual world. We can't say, well, look, I don't worship God, but now I don't do anything to hurt Christians either. Well, if you're not serving God, then you're hurting Christ. Because who did he die for? Everybody, didn't he? Even the ones who don't serve him. He died for them also. So you and I are the only ones that determine our destiny. Nothing outside of us can determine our destiny but ourselves. So our biggest thing to deal with is our own personal being. That's what we have to deal with. Now let's take a look at one other verse here. And I think this one is, again, one of those that you and I ought to love. Romans 8 and verse 18. Boy, this chapter is just beautiful things. Look at verse 18. For I reckon, that's a good old southern expression, isn't it? I know he must have been from the south, because reckon ain't something you hear up north. For I reckon that the suffering of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us. Wow. He said, whatever you give up in this life, is it any way in comparison to what you're going to receive? You think you and I don't get to do something, or we don't have something because we're serving the Lord? Is it going to be worth it on Judgment Day? Paul goes on to say, what about the eye? For the eye has not seen, nor the ear heard of the things that God has prepared for you and I. Is heaven a marvelous, unbelievably beautiful place to be? When he described heaven as fountains of water, crystal water, and street of gold, and gates of pearls, and walls of diamonds, is that what heaven looks like? Why did he describe it that way? Well, let me give you a hint. Over in John 14, the first 3 verses there, when he tells those disciples in the garden, he tells them that he's going to prepare a place for them. How did he describe that place? He called it what? A mansion. Is there this big white building with big front columns on the front of it and 12 bedrooms inside? Is that what I'm looking for when I get to heaven? Is heaven a physical or a spiritual place? It's spiritual, isn't it? What would I, a spirit, or you, a spirit, want with a house? But why did he describe it that way? Why did he make those 2 descriptions of heaven? All right. When you're telling somebody something, what do you have to do sometimes? You have to describe it in terms that they understand. If you were living in the 1st century and you thought about one day living in a mansion, would that be something that would be worth striving for? A physical mansion? Would it be worth striving to live in a place that's got a street of gold in it? And pearls on the gates and diamonds on the walls? Would that be worth it? If he was going to describe heaven in terms that you and I could understand, what would he do? Would he not take the most valuable, beautiful, precious things he could think of and tell you this is what it's like? That's not what it is, but it's like this. It's got the most beautiful things that beyond what we can think in that place called heaven. You see, I don't need a physical house to live in if I'm a spiritual being. And I don't need streets of gold if I'm a spiritual being. But to describe it in a way in which you and I would want to go there, he uses the most beautiful terms there are to describe it. And that makes it great. Well, we got about 1 minute. So I'm going to give you this as the question for next week. And Lord willing, we're going to get to it. I hope. I make no promises, but I hope. I want to ask you this, and I want you to think about it, and hopefully we'll have time next week to talk about it some. Are all sins equal? And are all commands equal? Let me give you a couple and you think about them. Is lying as bad as murdering? Is envy as bad as stealing? Is cursing as bad as adultery? Is not attending as bad as not being baptized? I want you to think about those. Are there mortal sins and venial sins? Are there sins that will damn the soul and other sins that are not good but they won't damn the soul to hell? if you commit them. Are there mortal and venial sins? The Catholic Church teaches that there are two types of sins. So we're going to talk about this next week. The difference between mortal and venial sins, and do all sins have the same consequence or not? All right, time's up. Thank you for your help, and hopefully next week we'll get into some more of these thoughts.